The Vanishing Village, the moment of silence written by Concealed Story Room. The night of December 11th, bleeding into the witching hours of December 12th, 1959, draped Briar Hollow in a quietude so profound it felt like a held breath. Snow, which had fallen lightly since dusk, now lay like a soft, undisturbed shroud over the sleeping village, muffling the world. Yet, beneath this visual silence, another sound, almost subliminal, had begun to weave itself into the fabric of the night, a rhythm, a pulse. It was the collective heartbeat of 47 clocks, scattered throughout the homes and establishments of Briar Hollow, their individual ticks and tocks somehow, impossibly, aligning. A subtle, pervasive synchronicity that most residents, deep in their slumber or lost in their late-night reveries, failed to consciously register, though it hummed beneath the floorboards and resonated in the chilled air like an unspoken secret. 1:58 a.m. In the mayor's parlor, a grand, somewhat faded room smelling of old leather and lemon oil, Mayor Alastair Thompson was decidedly not asleep. A tumbler of amber liquid sat half-empty on the polished mahogany of his desk, beside a precarious stack of township ledgers. He was a man whose worries were his constant companions, and tonight, the proposed coal mine on the old Cherokee lands weighed heavily. He'd argued for it, cajoled for it, promised prosperity. But a sliver of unease, sharp as a shard of glass, had lodged itself in his gut. He swirled the whiskey, the ice clinking with a lonely sound. "Just jitters, Alastair," he muttered to the empty room, the sound absorbed by the heavy velvet curtains. "Progress always has its price." His gaze drifted to the antique grandfather clock in the corner, a family heirloom that had chimed the hours through 3 generations of Thompsons. Its pendulum, a polished brass disc, swung with a steady, sonorous rhythm. Thump-chock, thump-chock. He'd always found it comforting, a symbol of continuity. But tonight, as he listened, a frown creased his brow. Was it faster? Or was it merely the whiskey, or the late hour, playing tricks on his senses? There seemed to be an urgency to its usually stately cadence, a hurried quality that mirrored the frantic thumping in his own chest. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the unsettling notion. A few streets over, in the small, tidy bedroom of the Miller house, 10-year-old Sarah Miller was also awake, though she feigned sleep whenever her mother, Martha, creaked open her door to check. Sarah was clutching her new doll, a Christmas gift come early, its plastic eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The little West clock's baby moon on her nightstand, its luminous dial a faint green glow in the darkness, ticked with a surprisingly loud insistence. Tick, 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 tick. Usually, it was a soothing sound, a tiny mechanical lullaby. But tonight, it felt insistent, almost demanding. She pulled the covers higher, a nameless anxiety fluttering in her small chest. She thought she could hear other clocks too, distant cousins to her own, their voices joining in a strange, unified chorus that seemed to vibrate through her pillow. 2:03 a.m. Miss Evelyn Albright, Briar Hollow's dedicated first-grade teacher, was still at the schoolhouse, a single lamp casting a pool of weary light over a desk littered with ungraded papers and half-finished Christmas decorations. She'd told herself she'd leave by midnight, then 1, then 1:30. Now, the large wall clock above the blackboard, its stern face a familiar sight to generations of children, seemed to mock her with its relentless march. Click, click, click. Evelyn sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. The silence of the empty schoolhouse was usually peaceful, a respite from the daytime chaos of 20 small bodies. But tonight, it felt charged. The air was heavy, and the rhythmic clicking of the clock seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness, each tick amplified, almost metallic. She found herself listening, not just to her clock, but to something else, a faint, pervasive ticking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Like the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for a downbeat. "Just tired, Evie, my girl," she whispered, reaching for another red ink paper. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of an immense, unseen presence just beyond the frosted windows. The scent of chalk dust and floor wax was suddenly overlaid with something else, a faint, almost imperceptible odor, sharp and clean, like the air before a lightning strike. In the alley behind Grady's diner, Jedediah Carter, Briar Hollow's resident philosopher of the rye bottle, was curled against a stack of empty crates, a thin blanket pulled over his shivering frame. He wasn't asleep, not quite. He was in that hazy borderland where dreams and reality blurred. He heard the clocks. Oh, he definitely heard them. Not just the distant chime from the town hall, but all of them. A chorus of tiny hammers beating against an unseen anvil. It was a rhythm he'd never noticed before, a frantic, synchronized pulse that made his teeth ache. Something's coming, he mumbled into the rough wool of his blanket, his words slurred. Something big. The gears are grinding, the whole damn town's wound too tight. He coughed, a racking sound, and the metallic taste in his mouth, usually just cheap whiskey, was sharper tonight, coppery, like he'd been sucking on old pennies. 2:06 a.m. The synchronized ticking had reached a crescendo, a frantic, unified beat that thrummed through Briar Hollow. It was no longer subliminal. It was a palpable force, a vibration in the bones, a pressure in the ears. In the Thompson house, Mayor Alastair Thompson stood abruptly, the ledgers forgotten. The grandfather clock's thumb chalk was now a frantic, almost panicked staccato. He stared at it, his heart hammering in unison. What in God's name? The air in the parlor felt thick, difficult to draw into his lungs. He could hear the smaller mantel clock in the hallway. Its usually delicate chime now a series of sharp, rapid clicks, perfectly aligned with the booming of the larger clock. It was impossible. Martha Miller, having finally drifted off to sleep, was jolted awake. Not by a sound, but by a feeling. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to be coming from the very foundations of the house. Her bedside clock, a sturdy electric model, was buzzing faintly, its second hand sweeping in perfect, unnerving lockstep with the insistent ticking from Sarah's room. "John?" she whispered, reaching for her husband. But John was a heavy sleeper, oblivious. Martha sat up, her skin prickling. The air tasted strange, metallic and sharp, like the tang of a battery held to the tongue. At the schoolhouse, Evelyn Albright dropped her pen. The large wall clock was visibly shuddering on its hook, its click, 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 now a desperate, hammering beat. The other faint tickings she'd sensed earlier were now a clear, undeniable chorus, 1,000 tiny metronomes all striking at the exact same instant. The smell of ozone, or something like it, was stronger now, making her nostrils flare. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, up her chair, into her very bones. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her fatigue. 2:07 a.m. The last sound heard in Briar Hollow on December 12, 1959, wasn't a scream. It wasn't a crash or a gunshot or the wail of a child. It was the synchronized ticking of 47 clocks. And then, it wasn't. In the mayor's parlor, the antique grandfather clock's pendulum, captured mid-swing at the apex of its frantic arc, froze. The thumb chalk died in its throat, replaced by a silence so absolute it was like a physical blow. Mayor Thompson gasped, stumbling back, his hand flying to his chest. The silence. It was deafening, a void where moments before there had been that impossible, synchronized rhythm. He stared at the frozen pendulum, a brass eye staring back, unblinking. In the schoolhouse, the teacher's wall clock gave a final, violent shudder. Its second hand, as if seized by an invisible force, bent backward with a soft, sickening screech of tortured metal, twisting against the numeral 4, then hung limp and broken. Evelyn Albright cried out, a small, choked sound, her eyes wide with terror. The hum beneath her feet ceased. The metallic tang in the air intensified for a moment, then vanished, leaving behind a silence that pressed in on her, suffocating. And in every bedroom, dime store alarm clocks, West clocks baby moons, their plastic casings still warm from the proximity of sleeping bodies, their luminous dials suddenly dim, fell silent with a final, feeble click. In Sarah Miller's room, the insistent ticking stopped. The green glow of her baby moon faded. Sarah, who had been drifting into an uneasy sleep, sat bolt upright. "Mommy," she whispered into the sudden, profound stillness. The silence wasn't empty. It felt heavy, watchful. Her doll's plastic eyes seemed to gleam in the sudden, deeper darkness. Her mother, Martha, was already out of bed, her heart pounding. "John, John, wake up," she hissed, shaking her husband. The electric clock on their nightstand was dark, its hum gone. The silence in the house was terrifying. It wasn't the normal quiet of night. It was a dead, sterile silence, as if all sound had been surgically removed from the world. Jedediah Carter, in his alleyway cocoon, felt the change like a physical blow. The frantic, synchronized ticking that had been drilling into his skull abruptly ceased. The coppery taste in his mouth was suddenly overwhelming, and a wave of intense nausea washed over him. He gagged, trying to sit up. The world seemed to tilt, the shadows around him writhing, moving wrong. "Oh, sweet Mary," he groaned. A single, flat clang, like a distant, cracked bell, echoed in his mind, or perhaps in the air itself. Then, nothing but the crushing weight of the unnatural silence. The clocks were only the first clue. For a few heartbeats, nothing else seemed to happen. The silence reigned, absolute and terrifying. In dozens of homes across Briar Hollow, people were stirring, confused, a primal fear beginning to dawn. Husbands and wives whispered to each other in the dark. Children called out for parents who were suddenly, inexplicably, unable to answer with reassurance. In the Thompson house, Mayor Thompson fumbled for the light switch, his hand shaking. The lamp clicked on, casting a sickly yellow glow. The grandfather clock stood silent, a stoic, dead sentinel. He could feel a cold draft, though the windows were closed. A prickling sensation crawled over his skin, as if the air itself had become charged with an unseen energy. He thought of the coal mine, the Cherokee warnings he'd dismissed. A tremor of superstitious fear, alien to his pragmatic nature, shook him. "Martha," he called out, his voice hoarse, though his wife was miles away in their own home. He felt an overwhelming urge to check on his own family, a sudden, inexplicable certainty that they were in terrible danger. Evelyn Albright remained frozen at her desk in the schoolhouse, her gaze fixed on the broken clock. The silence was a living thing, pressing in on her, stealing her breath. She wanted to scream, but her throat was constricted. She felt a strange lightness, a sense of disassociation, as if she were observing herself from a great distance. The edges of her vision seemed to shimmer, the familiar objects in the classroom losing their solidity. The faint scent of ozone returned, stronger now, accompanied by an almost inaudible, high-pitched whine that seemed to bypass her ears and drill directly into her brain. Little Sarah Miller began to cry, soft, frightened sobs in the oppressive darkness of her room. "Mommy? Daddy?" The silence that answered was more terrifying than any monster under the bed. She felt a strange pulling sensation, a gentle but irresistible tug, as if the very air around her was drawing her upwards. The room seemed to be fading, the familiar shapes of her furniture dissolving into a gray, indistinct mist. Martha Miller, now frantic, was shaking her husband, John, with all her strength. "John, please. Wake up. Something's wrong, terribly wrong." He finally groaned, stirring. "Wow, what is it, Marth?" Middle of the night. His voice was groggy, confused. "The clocks, John. They've all stopped. And the air it feels. I don't know." As John Miller struggled to sit up, a faint, ethereal glow began to emanate from the windowsill. It was a soft, pulsing light, like heat lightning trapped in a bottle. Martha stared, mesmerized and terrified. On the wooden sill, 3 interlocking circles were beginning to form, not carved, not scratched, but searing themselves into the wood, the lines glowing like molten glass, edges smooth as if drawn by a celestial blowtorch. There was no smoke, no flame, just the silent, impossible appearance of the symbol, accompanied by that high-pitched whine that was now making her teeth ache. What is that?" John whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, unimaginable horror. The family dog in the Peterson house, a normally boisterous golden retriever named Goldie, began to whimper from the locked basement, a low, mournful sound that escalated into a series of short, terrified yelps. He wasn't barking at an intruder. He was cowering against the cold concrete wall, his body trembling violently, his tail tucked so far between his legs it was almost invisible. His sensitive ears were flattened against his skull, trying to block out the high-frequency whine that humans were only just beginning to perceive. His eyes, wide and reflecting a terror beyond animal comprehension, were fixed on the basement door, as if he could see something monstrous passing through the wood. He'd witnessed something that shattered his canine understanding of the world, a silent, invisible force that reeked of ozone and wrongness. Across Briar Hollow, similar scenes were unfolding in the terrifying, unnatural silence. The brief period of confusion was giving way to a pervasive, creeping dread. The air grew colder, imbued with that strange, high-frequency whine and the faint, sharp scent of burnt copper and ozone. Reality itself seemed to be fraying at the edges. People felt a strange lethargy, a sense of detachment, even as panic clawed at their throats. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to deepen, to lengthen, to move with a volition that was not their own. The last coherent thought Mayor Alastair Thompson had was of the date on the mining contract, December 12th. The irony was a cold, bitter taste in his mouth. He felt a gentle pressure, a lifting sensation. The grandfather clock, the room, his own body, all seemed to be dissolving into a shimmering, gray light. Evelyn Albright closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The high-pitched whine filled her head, blotting out all thought. She felt no pain, only a profound sense of inevitability, of being swept away by a tide far too powerful to resist. The image of the three interlocking circles, though she had not seen them form, burned brightly behind her eyelids. Sarah Miller reached out for her mother, her small hand grasping at empty air. The gray mist enveloped her, cool and strangely peaceful. The fear was fading, replaced by a vast, empty quiet. By dawn, 327 people had vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no bloodstains or broken furniture. Just empty homes where breakfasts would never be eaten, where coffee pots had long since boiled dry, where family dogs whimpered behind locked basement doors, unharmed but trembling violently, their tails tucked between their legs as if they'd witnessed something even their instincts couldn't comprehend. And then there were the symbols, seared into every windowsill in Briar Hollow. 3 interlocking circles, glistening like black glass in the pale morning light. A silent, terrifying testament to the night the clock stopped, and an entire village was stolen from the world. The true nightmare, for those left behind to find it, was only just beginning. The gray, spectral light of dawn on December 12, 1959, did little to dispel the unnatural chill that had clamped down on Briar Hollow. The snow, which had ceased its gentle fall hours ago, lay pristine and undisturbed, a silent white blanket over a village that had, in the space of a few heartbeats, become a tomb. The only sounds were the mournful whimpers of abandoned dogs, their terror a lonely counterpoint to the profound, echoing silence where human voices should have been. 6:05 a.m. Frank Henderson's milk truck, a familiar, rumbling beast of comfort and routine, was the first intrusion into this frozen tableau. Its headlights cut twin beams through the pre-dawn gloom as it trundled down Route 17, the rhythmic clinking of glass bottles in their metal crates a sound as dependable as the sunrise. Frank, a man whose life was measured in the pre-dawn rituals of countless mornings, hummed a tuneless Christmas carol, his breath fogging in the cold cab. He'd delivered milk to Briar Hollow for 23 years. He knew its rhythms, its quirks, its sleeping habits, as intimately as he knew the lines on his own worn hands. His first frown came as he passed the Miller farm, just on the outskirts. No warm, welcoming lantern burned in their kitchen window. No plume of wood smoke curled invitingly from their chimney. Just a stark, cold stillness that felt alien. "Sleepin' in, are we, John?" Frank muttered, a slight unease pricking at the edges of his usual cheer. Not like Martha to let the stove go cold. As he turned onto Main Street, the unease solidified into a nod of genuine concern. The street was a ghost. Grady's diner, usually a beacon of light and the smell of frying bacon by this hour, was dark. Its neon open sign, a cheerful pink and blue promise, was lifeless. The small stack of the Briar Hollow Chronicle at the newspaper stand beside the diner's entrance hadn't been touched, its headline about the upcoming Christmas pageant starkly visible under the thin layer of untouched snow. He pulled the truck to a halt in front of the diner, the engine's grumble dying into the oppressive silence. The only sound now was the frantic thumping of his own heart. He cut the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, a physical weight. "Grady," Frank called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud, absorbed by the snow and the shuttered storefronts. "You in there, old man?" No answer. Just the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the diner sign, swaying in the frigid breeze. He climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on the fresh snow, leaving the first human footprints on Main Street that morning. His breath plumed white, a fleeting ghost in the chilled air. He peered through the diner window. Darkness. But he could smell it, the acrid scent of burnt coffee, a familiar aroma that now carried a sinister undertone. His hand, trembling slightly, reached for the diner door. It swung open easily, its bell tinkling with a bright, incongruous cheerfulness that made him flinch. "Hello," he called, stepping inside. The air within was cold, but thick with the lingering smells of a breakfast abruptly abandoned. Burnt coffee, yes, and the faint, greasy aroma of bacon. His eyes, adjusting to the dim light filtering from the street, fell upon the counter. A plate of eggs, sunny side up, sat there, the yolk glistening under the weak light. A fork was balanced precariously on the rim of the plate, a single bite taken from one of the eggs. A coffee cup sat beside it, half full. "Grady," Frank whispered, his throat suddenly dry. He took a step further in. The cash register was closed. A newspaper lay open on a stool, as if its reader had merely stepped away for a moment. But the silence was wrong. It was a dead, watchful silence. He backed out slowly, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. He thought of the Wilsons, further down the street. Their porch light was always on for him. He looked. Darkness. Old man Grady, always up brewing coffee by 5:30 a.m. sharp. And little Tommy Carter, who'd usually be sneaking out by now to meet him at the crossroads by the old oak, begging for an extra half pint of chocolate milk before school. The crossroads were empty. The old oak stood like a skeletal sentinel against the pale dawn sky. Then he heard it. Faint. Ethereal. A sound so out of place in this landscape of dread that it made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Singing. A hymn, reverent and sorrowful, drifting from the direction of the Briar Hollow Community Church across the town square. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered in Frank's chest. A town meeting? A special service? He hurried across the square, his boots leaving a trail in the virgin snow, the only sign of life in a world gone still. The massive oak doors of the church stood slightly ajar, a dark invitation into the echoing space within. He pushed one door further open, the hinges groaning in protest. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling. "Anyone here?" The singing, which had seemed to fill the cold air just moments before, stopped. Abruptly, as if a switch had been thrown, or a breath collectively held. The silence that followed was even more profound, more terrifying than before. Frank stepped across the threshold. Every pew was empty. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the stained glass windows, illuminating scenes of serene apostles and benevolent saviors who seemed to offer no comfort now. Bibles lay open on many of the pews, some on the seats, some fallen to the floor as if dropped in sudden alarm. He picked one up. It was open to Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yeah, we wept, when we remembered Zion. The words blurred before his eyes. He could smell it here too, that faint, sharp, metallic tang, like ozone or burnt batteries, mingling with the familiar scent of old wood and beeswax. He backed away, a choked sob escaping his lips. This wasn't a meeting. This wasn't a service. This was something else. Something monstrous. He stumbled out of the church, his eyes darting wildly around the empty square. Miller's Hill, usually alive with the shouts of children if there was even a dusting of snow, was deserted. Little Sarah Miller's brand-new sled, the one she'd begged her father for last Christmas, sat abandoned mid-slope, its bright red paint a stark slash against the white, its ropes still tied in a perfect and used bow. Frank Henderson, a man of simple routines and simpler fears, felt his sanity fraying. He scrambled back to his truck, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the door handle. He fumbled with the radio transmitter, his voice a ragged, panicked plea to the crackling void. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Frank Henderson. Briar Hollow. Something's happened. Everyone's gone. Oh God, everyone's gone." 7:30 a.m. Deputy Miles Corbin, young, barely a year on the force, and accustomed to a beat where the most exciting event was a stray cow on the highway, arrived in Briar Hollow with a sense of profound disbelief. Frank Henderson's frantic, near-hysterical radio call had been relayed through dispatch, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality. He found Frank by his truck, pale and shivering, his eyes wide with a terror that looked chillingly authentic. "Frank, what in tarnation is going on?" Corbin asked, trying to keep his voice steady, authoritative, though a knot of unease was already tightening in his own stomach. The silence of the town was the first thing that hit him. It wasn't just quiet, it was a dead, echoing void. They're gone, Miles. Everyone. Just vanished. Frank's voice was a hoarse whisper. He recounted his morning discoveries: the darkened Miller farm, the silent diner with its half-eaten breakfast, the empty church, the abandoned sled. And the clocks, Miles. I went into a few houses on Elm Street, just to check. Mrs. Henderson's, no relation, her little alarm clock, the one with the chirping bird, stopped. 2:07 a.m. Same as the one in the diner. Same as the big one at the school. I peeked through the window. The hand was bent backwards, Miles. Like something forced it. Corbin's pen, poised over his notepad, froze. Bent. He'd heard about the clocks in Frank's initial call, but the detail of a bent hand, that was new. That was deeply unsettling. Show me, Frank. Show me everything. Together, they walked the silent streets, Frank's earlier terror now a grim, guiding commentary, Corbin's initial skepticism slowly eroding with every empty house, every sign of abruptly interrupted life. Grady's diner was exactly as Frank had described. The plate of eggs, the fork, the burnt coffee. Corbin, trying to maintain a professional detachment, noted the untouched cash register. This wasn't a robbery. He checked the back door, locked from the inside. The church was even more unnerving. The open Bibles, the lingering metallic scent that made the hairs on Corbin's arms stand up, the sudden cessation of the singing Frank swore he'd heard. Corbin picked up a Bible, its pages cool beneath his fingertips. Psalm 137. He felt a shiver trace its way down his spine, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the December morning. You're sure about the singing, Frank? Frank nodded, his eyes haunted. As sure as I'm standing here. It was beautiful and sad, and then it just cut off. The second I stepped inside. Corbin keyed his own radio, his voice more strained than he intended. Dispatch, this is Corbin in Briar Hollow. You might want to send up a few more units. And call the state boys. Something's real wrong up here. The dispatcher's voice, usually a calm, bored drawl, held a new note of urgency. Copy that, Corbin. More units en route. State police have been notified. What's the situation exactly? Henderson's call was a bit agitated. Corbin looked around the empty church, at the silent pews, at Frank Henderson's ashen face. The metallic tang in the air seemed to grow stronger, almost making his teeth ache. The situation, dispatch, he said slowly, the words feeling heavy and inadequate, is that there is no situation. There's nothing. And that's the goddamned problem. He then led Frank to the schoolhouse. Peering through the window, Corbin saw it. The large wall clock, its second hand indeed bent grotesquely backward against the numeral 4, like a broken limb. A wave of nausea hit him. This wasn't just a mass desertion. This was something else. Something that could warp metal with its passing. What could do that, Frank? Corbin whispered, more to himself than the milkman. Frank just shook his head, his eyes filled with a primal fear. Nothing human, Miles. Nothing I've ever seen or heard of. 11 a.m. By late morning, Briar Hollow was a sealed zone. State police cruisers formed a loose, almost bewildered perimeter. Troopers, their faces grim and etched with a mixture of disbelief and professional resolve, moved with a cautious efficiency that couldn't quite mask their profound unease. They cleared houses methodically, their calls of state police. Anyone home? Echoing unanswered through silent rooms where life had been arrested mid-frame. A half-knitted sweater on a living room couch, needles still in the yarn. A child's drawing of a lopsided Santa Claus on a kitchen table, crayons scattered beside it. A bathtub still holding lukewarm water. The sheer normalcy of the scenes, juxtaposed with the utter absence of human life, was what chilled them to the bone. This wasn't a panic evacuation. This was an erasure. 3 p.m. Special Agent Marcus Thorne of the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived as the winter sun, already weak, began its premature descent, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the periphery of vision. Thorne was a man built of sharp angles and sharper intellect, his eyes the color of a winter storm, his dark suit an incongruous slash of formality against the rural backdrop. With him was a younger agent, Carl Whitaker, barely a year out of Quantico, his eagerness warring with a palpable sense of apprehension as he took in the ring of silent, watchful houses. Captain Miller of the State Police, a man whose usually ruddy complexion was now a pasty gray, met them at the makeshift command post set up in the town's silent fire station. "Agent Thorne, Agent Whitaker. Glad you're here," Miller said, though his tone lacked any real gladness. It was heavy with exhaustion and a dawning horror. "Never seen anything like it. Not in 30 years on the force." "Give me the rundown, Captain," Thorne said, his voice a low, impatient rumble. "And spare me the local color, if you please. Facts only." Miller ran a hand over his tired face, his gaze drifting towards the silent town. "Facts are, Agent Thorne, we've got a village of 327 souls. Men, women, children. All gone. Vanished. Poof." He snapped his fingers, a dry, inadequate sound. No witnesses. No ransom notes. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. No bodies. It's like they just evaporated. Whitaker, diligently taking notes, felt a cold prickle despite the stuffy air in the fire station. Evaporated. The same word Frank Henderson had used. "We've done a preliminary sweep of about 60% of the residences and all the businesses on Main Street," Miller continued. "It's the same story everywhere. Life interrupted. Meals half-eaten, beds unmade, some still warm when my men first went in hours ago. TVs and radios. Well, the radios are acting peculiar." "Peculiar how?" Thorne pressed, his gaze sharp, unblinking. "Every single radio we've found, Agent Thorne, and we're talking dozens, from kitchen transistors to those big console hi-fis. They're all tuned to the same frequency. Dead static. Loud. Nearest station signed off at midnight. But this static, it's active, like it's being broadcast. And here's the kicker. When you unplug them, the static continues. For exactly 17 seconds. Then it cuts out. We've timed it on multiple sets. 17 seconds, to the tick." Thorne stared at him, his expression unreadable. 17 seconds of post-power static? On every set? "You're sure?" "Positive, sir. Like they've got some kind of residual charge. Or something else is making them play." Miller's voice was strained. "It's unnerving." Whitaker scribbled furiously. "Radios, static, 17 seconds post-unplug." This wasn't in any textbook. This was edging into territory that made his skin crawl. "And the clocks," Miller said, his voice dropping further, as if afraid of being overheard by the silent houses themselves. "The milkman, Henderson, first one on scene, he noticed it. Every clock in town we've checked, and that's a lot, sir, stopped. Dead. At precisely 2:07 a.m. Synchronized failure?" Thorne mused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "A massive power surge. No power surge reported by the electric company, sir. We checked. And we're talking all kinds of clocks. Wind-ups, battery-operated, electric, all of them. The big grandfather clock in the mayor's parlor? Pendulum frozen mid-swing. The clock in the schoolhouse. The second hand is bent backward, wrapped around the numeral 4 like it was fighting something. It's unnatural, Agent Thorne. There's no other word for it." "Unnatural," Thorne repeated, the word tasting like ash on his tongue. He preferred terms like unexplained, anomalous. Unnatural was for late-night horror shows. Let's see some of this for ourselves. Start with the diner. Then the schoolhouse. Grady's diner was a mausoleum of interrupted routine. The half-eaten eggs, the cooling coffee, the eerie silence. Thorne examined the scene with a meticulous, almost predatory focus, his eyes missing nothing. Whitaker felt a fresh wave of nausea. The sheer, mundane domesticity of it, frozen in time, was grotesque. No usable prints on the plate, the fork, the counter. Agent Thorne, a state forensics tech, reported, his voice muffled by his mask. He looked pale. Wiped clean. Or, they were never there to begin with. Same story throughout the premises we've processed so far. Doorknobs, glasses, tables, nothing. It's like the whole town was wearing gloves. Or every surface has been meticulously, impossibly scrubbed by an invisible hand." Thorne grunted, a non-committal sound. "Or something else entirely." He ran a gloved finger along a chrome napkin holder. It gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. His eyes narrowed, a sudden intensity in his gaze. "What in God's name is this?" Etched, or rather seared, into the curved metal surface was a symbol. 3 perfectly interlocking circles. The lines were impossibly fine, yet deep, the metal around them subtly discolored, as if by an intense, focused burst of heat. Captain Miller's face tightened. "We're seeing that everywhere too, sir. On almost every windowsill in town. But also on mirrors, other metallic surfaces, anything reflective, it seems. Same design. 3 interlocking circles. We didn't notice them at first, not until the light hit them just right." Whitaker leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. The symbol was elegant, almost hypnotic in its geometric precision, yet it radiated a profound sense of alienness. It felt ancient and deeply, deeply disturbing. It tugged at something in his memory, some forgotten lecture on arcane symbols, but it remained just out of reach. "Seared, you said?" Thorne asked, his attention locked on the symbol, his voice dangerously soft. "Our preliminary assessment points that way, yes. Not carved, not stamped. The edges are too smooth, almost melted. We found one on a wooden windowsill in the mayor's house. Our tech, a good man, ex-Navy, said the heat required to make that kind of mark in wood, that cleanly, without igniting the surrounding area, it would have to exceed 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and be applied for an incredibly short, precise duration. He said it was impossible. 2,000 degrees. Whitaker breathed, the number hanging in the chilled air like a death sentence. How is that even possible without burning the whole place down? Thorne didn't answer. He was staring at his own reflection in the curved surface of the napkin holder, distorted and strange. For a fleeting, sickening moment, he thought he saw his reflected eyes blink out of sync with his own, a tiny, almost imperceptible lag. He blinked hard, dismissing it as a trick of the light, a product of fatigue and the sheer, mounting outlandishness of the situation. But the image lingered, a tiny splinter of doubt, cold and sharp, lodging itself in his carefully constructed wall of skepticism. "The bank," Thorne said abruptly, his voice harsher than usual, pulling Whitaker from his daze. The original report mentioned something found in the Briar Hollow First Bank. In the vault. The Briar Hollow First Bank was a small, unassuming brick building on the corner of Main and Elm. Its vault, a heavy, old-fashioned steel door that looked like it could withstand a direct hit, had been found closed but, inexplicably, unlocked. Inside, the safe deposit boxes were untouched. Stacks of neatly bound currency lay undisturbed in their designated drawers. There was only one thing out of place. One thing that didn't belong. A single sheet of plain white paper sat dead center on the vault's dusty concrete floor. Thorne knelt, picking it up with the delicate precision of a surgeon, his gloved fingers barely touching the edges. 12 words were typed on it, in a crisp, unremarkable Courier New font, the ink stark and black against the white. "They are not lost. They are where you will be soon." Underneath the chilling, unambiguous message, a date and time. December 12th, 1959. 2:07 a.m. A silence descended in the cramped, cold vault, thicker and more suffocating than any they had yet encountered in this godforsaken town. Whitaker felt the blood drain from his face, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. This wasn't just a mass disappearance. This was a proclamation, a direct and terrifying threat. The specificity of the time, 2:07 a.m., the exact moment the clocks had stopped, the moment the town had died, sent a jolt of pure, undiluted dread through him. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. "Bag it," Thorne ordered, his voice a low, strained growl, but Whitaker could see a muscle twitching uncontrollably in his jaw, a betraying sign of the pressure he was under. "Get it to the lab in Quantico. Full analysis. Paper stock, ink composition, typeface, any latent prints, DNA, trace evidence, anything and everything." He stared at the spot where the paper had lain, his eyes narrowed, as if expecting more words to materialize from the cold steel and concrete. "Where you will be soon," he murmured, almost to himself, the words a venomous echo in the stillness. A promise or a goddamned prophecy? Captain Miller cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. There's one more thing, Agent Thorne. Or rather, one more person. Jedediah Carter. Town drunk. My deputies found him a few hours ago. He was in a peculiar state. And a peculiar place. 4:30 p.m. Jedediah Carter was curled in a tight fetal position on the narrow, stained cot in one of the town's two primitive jail cells, located in the back of the equally primitive town hall. The cell door, constructed of heavy iron bars, was locked. From the inside, a deputy had to use a crowbar, straining and cursing, to pry the door open just enough to slip the rusted bolt. Carter stank of cheap rye, stale sweat, unwashed clothes, and something else, that same sharp, pervasive metallic odor they'd noticed in the church, in the diner, but stronger here, almost overpowering, like burnt copper wires. His eyes, when he finally, reluctantly, opened them to slits, were bloodshot and wild, darting around the cramped cell as if seeing phantoms in the encroaching shadows. "Mr. Carter?" Thorne began, his voice carefully neutral, devoid of judgment. "We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to ask you some questions about what happened in Briar Hollow last night, or early this morning." Jedediah flinched violently at the sound of Thorne's voice, scrambling back against the cold stone wall like a cornered animal. "Happened," he rasped, his voice like sandpaper on wood. "Oh, it happened all right. It surely did happen." He let out a dry, rattling laugh that held no humor, only a deep, echoing despair. "They came, like shadows, but wrong. Move in all wrong, slide in when they should have stepped." "Who came, Jedediah?" Whitaker asked gently, crouching down to be closer to eye level, though the multi-layered stench emanating from the man made him want to retch. "What did you see? Can you help us understand?" Carter's wild eyes fixed on Whitaker, a strange, unsettling lucidity flickering within their bloodshot depths. "Saw the sky, it crackled, like summer lightning, but silent. No thunder, just a hum. A deep, thrumming hum that vibrated in your teeth, in your bones." His gaze drifted to the small, barred window of the cell, which offered only a view of a brick wall. Then the bells, the church bells. They rang. Just once. A single, flat clang. Not like Sunday morning bells, not joyful. This was flat. Dead. Wrong. "And then what happened, Jedediah?" Thorne pressed, his skepticism warring with a reluctant, morbid fascination. The man was clearly terrified, possibly delusional, yet his words held a disturbing consistency with some of the other anomalies. "Then the air, it tasted like batteries," Jedediah whispered, his face contorting in remembered disgust, his tongue flicking out as if to rid itself of the phantom taste. "Sharp, bitter, made your teeth ache. And the quiet. Oh, Lord, the quiet that came after. It wasn't empty, see? It was full of something waiting, something listening." He started to tremble, his gaze darting towards the cell door, as if expecting some new horror to manifest. They were just gone. Everyone. Like the earth just opened up and swallowed him whole. Or the sky did. A local deputy, a young man named Peters who looked barely old enough to shave and was visibly shaken by the day's events, hovered nervously by the cell door. He handed Thorne a small, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was a crude drawing, sketched on a torn piece of a Lucky Strike cigarette carton, the lines made with what looked like soot or burnt wood. It depicted 3 interlocking circles. "He had this in his pocket when we found him, Agent Thorne," Deputy Peters said, his voice hushed. "We showed it to him earlier, when he was a bit more coherent. He got real agitated." Thorne held up the bag, the symbol stark and black even in its crude rendering. "Mr. Carter, do you recognize this symbol? Did you draw this?" Jedediah's reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly violent. He recoiled as if the bag contained a venomous snake, a strangled cry tearing from his throat. He scrambled further into the corner, his hands flying up to shield his face, his body racked with tremors. "Get it away!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "Get that cursed thing away from me. It ain't a drawing. It ain't no damn drawing, you fools." "Then what is it, Jedediah?" Thorne's voice was sharp now, a scalpel cutting through the man's rising hysteria. "If it's not a drawing, what is it?" Carter lowered his hand slowly, his eyes burning with a feverish, almost prophetic intensity. He pointed a trembling, dirt-encrusted finger at the symbol in the bag. "It's a door," he hissed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more chilling than his earlier shouts. "A doorway. And they opened it. Oh God, they opened it, and something looked through." The metallic scent of burnt copper seemed to intensify in the cramped cell, prickling Whitaker's nostrils, making his eyes water. He looked at Thorne, whose face was a grim, unreadable mask, but the muscle in his jaw was twitching again, faster this time. A door. The word echoed in the confines of the small, cold cell, imbued with a terrifying, incomprehensible significance. The silence of Briar Hollow, which had seemed merely empty before, now pressed in around them, no longer vacant, but pregnant with the weight of Jedediah's mad pronouncements and the chilling implications of a symbol that was not a drawing, but a doorway to the unknown. A gateway to what? Outside the grimy window of the town hall, the early winter twilight had deepened into a bruised, ominous purple. The first snowflakes of a gathering storm, heavier now, began to drift down, silent and white, slowly blanketing the forsaken village, covering the seared symbols on the windowsills, as if nature itself were trying to conceal the nightmare that had unfolded beneath. But for Thorne and Whitaker, the nightmare was only just beginning to unfurl its dark, insidious tendrils. The questions were piling up, each one more disturbing, more impossible than the last, and the only answers seemed to lie in the ravings of a traumatized drunk and a cryptic, typed note that promised a shared, terrible destiny. The cold of Briar Hollow was settling deep into their bones, a chilling premonition that had nothing to do with the weather. Whitaker found himself staring at his own reflection in the darkened window of their bureau car as they prepared to leave the town hall for their temporary base at the county sheriff's office. For a horrifying, heart-stopping instant, he saw not his own tired, scared face, but a fleeting, almost subliminal glimpse of the three interlocking circles superimposed over his eyes, glowing faintly with an internal, malevolent light in the deepening gloom. He gasped, jerking back, his heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to escape his chest. When he dared to look again, his reflection was normal, just his own pale, shaken face staring back. A trick of the light? Or something more? "You all right, kid?" Thorne's voice, rougher than usual, cut through his panic. The senior agent was watching him, his eyes narrowed. Whitaker nodded, unable to speak for a moment, his throat tight with a fear he couldn't name. "Fine, sir. Just tired." He wasn't sure he'd ever be truly fine again. The symbols weren't just on the windowsills or the mirrors or pieces of trash anymore. They were starting to seep into their minds, into their perceptions, branding themselves onto their sanity. A door, Jedediah had called it. And Whitaker had the sudden, terrifying, gut-wrenching certainty that whatever had passed through that door from the other side was still lingering, watching them, waiting, and perhaps it was already reaching for them. The first 48 hours were drawing to a close, but the investigation into the vanishing of Briar Hollow had barely scratched the surface of an abyss. The stakes were already impossibly high. 327 souls were missing, and a chilling message hinted that the investigators themselves were already marked. The mystery of Briar Hollow was not just a case. It was a creeping infection of the unreal, a descent into a thriller where the rules of logic no longer applied, and the silence of the village was a scream an entire world was about to hear. The snows of December 1959 had long since melted, replaced by the reluctant green of a spring that brought no renewal to Briar Hollow. The village remained a quarantined wound on the face of West Virginia, a place of perpetual, chilling twilight in the minds of those who had breached its silence. 3 months had passed since the vanishing. 3 months of dead ends, of mounting impossibilities, and of a silence from the vanished that was as absolute as the grave. For Special Agents Marcus Thorne and Carl Whitaker, Briar Hollow had become an obsession, a Gordian knot of inexplicable phenomena that tightened its grip with each passing day. Their temporary field office, set up in a disused wing of the nearest county courthouse, was a chaotic shrine to the bizarre. Maps of Briar Hollow littered with pins and cryptic notes, photographs of empty rooms and seared symbols, transcripts of Frank Henderson's tearful testimony and Jedediah Carter's fevered pronouncements. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cigarettes, and the unspoken dread that clung to them like a second skin. The note from the vault, "They are not lost. They are where you will be soon," was pinned to the center of their evidence board, a typed oracle of doom. Whitaker found his eyes drawn to it constantly, the words a cold whisper in the back of his mind. His nights were plagued by dreams of interlocking circles and silent, screaming faces. The fleeting vision he'd had of the symbols superimposed on his reflection had not repeated, but the memory of it was a raw, festering wound. Thorn, outwardly, remained the stoic professional, his focus a laser beam cutting through the fog of the uncanny. But Whitaker saw the cracks, the deeper lines etched around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed incessantly on any available surface, the almost manic intensity with which he pursued every lead, no matter how outlandish. Anything from forensics on the vault note? Whitaker asked one late March afternoon, the words sounding tired even to his own ears. The rain outside beat a mournful tattoo against the grimy window panes. Thorn looked up from a topographical map of the region surrounding Briar Hollow, his expression grim. Nothing. Standard paper stock, common courier new typeface, untraceable. No prints, no DNA, no trace elements that shouldn't be there. It's like it materialized out of thin air, just like the goddamned symbols. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. And Jedediah Carter? Still locked up in the county sanatorium. Still raving about doors and shadows moving wrong. His system was clean of everything but cheap rye, by the way. No hallucinogens. So, we have a town that vanished, clocks that stopped on a dime, symbols seared by impossible heat, radios that played dead static for 17 seconds after being unplugged, a town drunk who saw God knows what, and a note that promises we're next on the cosmic itinerary. Whitaker summarized, the litany of impossibilities sounding more insane with each recitation, and not a single rational explanation in sight. Thorn slammed his fist on the table, making the coffee cups jump. There has to be an explanation, Whitaker. We're FBI agents, not ghost hunters. This isn't some backwoods spook story. This is something else. Something that follows rules, even if we don't understand them yet. But what if the rules aren't ours, Marcus? Whitaker ventured, using Thorn's first name in a rare moment of shared frustration. What if they're from somewhere else? Before Thorn could retort, the door creaked open and Assistant Director Harrison Meade stepped in, his tailored suit and polished demeanor a stark contrast to the disarray of their makeshift office. Meade was the face of bureau propriety, a man who preferred his mysteries neatly solved and filed away, preferably before they hit the newspapers. Briar Hollow was giving him an ulcer. "Gentlemen," Meade said, his voice clipped, "I trust you're making progress." His eyes swept the room, lingering on the evidence board with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. "We're exploring several avenues, sir," Thorn said, his voice carefully neutral. Meade sniffed. "Avenues that are leading where, exactly, Thorn?" Langley is getting antsy. The press is starting to sniff around the edges of the quarantine zone. Gas leak isn't going to hold them off forever. We need answers, not more questions. "With all due respect, sir," Whitaker interjected, emboldened by Thorn's earlier outburst, "the questions this case raises are unprecedented." Meade fixed Whitaker with a cold stare. "Agent Whitaker, your job is to find precedents, or to establish them, not to be overwhelmed by novelty." He turned back to Thorn. "I have something for you. Highly classified. Eyes only. Came through back channels, a source with ties to, let's just say, the other side of the Iron Curtain." He slid a thin, red-bordered file across the table. "Project Moros. Soviet designation. Happened back in '86. Or rather, rehappened." Thorn picked up the file, his eyes narrowing. "Rehappened. March 4th, 1986, to be precise," Meade said, his voice dropping. "A Soviet physics team, deep in Siberia. Remote outpost. They recorded what they termed an anomalous energy discharge. At precisely 2:07 a.m. Moscow time." Whitaker felt a chill crawl up his spine. 2:07 a.m. The same time. Thorn was already flipping through the file, his face a mask of intense concentration. It contained grainy satellite images, heavily redacted Cyrillic text, and a few translated summaries. "Their logs, or what we could get of them," Meade continued, "describe a village materializing in the snow. Out of nowhere. It was there for approximately 317 seconds. Then it vanished again. A village." Whitaker breathed. "Briar Hollow?" "The descriptions are suggestive," Meade conceded. "Church steeple, layout, it matches. But the disturbing part, gentlemen, is what their instruments, and one very unfortunate conscript, recorded. He paused for effect. Figures. Inside this materialized village. Pounding on invisible barriers. Mouths stretched in silent screams. One of them, designated Subject 17, apparently broke free, or partially free, for a few seconds. Long enough to shriek one thing, in English, before, and I quote, dissolving into static. What did he shriek? Thorne's voice was a low growl. Meade met his gaze. Tell them to stop ringing the bells. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Stop ringing the bells. Jedediah Carter's fevered claim. Claims the church bells rang once. Whitaker felt sick. Dissolving into static? Like the radios. The KGB buried the report, of course, Meade said, ignoring Whitaker's question. But a photo survived. Blurry, but the weather vane on the church in the image. It's an exact match for the one on the Briar Hollow Community Church. He tapped the file. This stays between us. The director wants plausible deniability if this blows up. But he also wants to know what the hell we're dealing with. Is this Soviet tech? Some kind of temporal weapon? Thorne closed the file slowly. No, sir, he said, his voice flat. This isn't Soviet. This is something else. The unspoken words, something older, something worse, hung palpably in the room. Find out what, Thorne, Meade said, his voice like ice. And find out soon, before whatever it is decides to pay us a visit. He turned and left, the click of the door latch echoing in the sudden silence. For a long moment, neither agent spoke. Whitaker stared at the red file as if it were a venomous snake. Silent screams, pounding on invisible barriers. My God, Marcus, are they trapped? Are they alive in some other place, reliving that moment? Thorne didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, staring out at the relentless rain. Jedediah's bells. The Soviets' bells. There's a connection. But what does it mean? He turned back, his eyes burning with a renewed, almost desperate intensity. This Project Moros, it happened in '86. Briar Hollow was 59. 27 years. Is there a cycle? A pattern? The note said, they are where you will be soon, Whitaker whispered. It didn't say when. The Soviet file, while terrifying, also opened a new, albeit deeply unsettling, avenue of inquiry. It led Thorne to dig into older, more obscure FBI cases, looking for patterns, for any hint of similar anomalous events. That's how he stumbled upon the file of Dr. Lorne Peachy. Peachy Lorne, Princeton physicist, consulted for the Bureau in the early 90s on unconventional spatial dynamics. Thorne read aloud from a dusty, archived file a week later. They were back in the sterile environment of Quantico, a temporary reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere of Briar Hollow's periphery. He was brought in to look at the Briar Hollow symbols, long after the initial investigation had gone cold. Whitaker leaned over his shoulder. What did he find? His conclusion? Thorne's voice was tight. The 3 interlocking circles weren't a warning. He claimed they were coordinates. Coordinates. Whitaker felt a jolt. Coordinates for what? He theorized they marked points where our dimension brushes against another. Thorne said, the words feeling absurd even as he uttered them. And on December 12, 1959, something, or someone, used those coordinates to pull Briar Hollow through. Pulled them through. Whitaker's mind reeled. Like Jedediah's door? Peachy had proof, or what he called proof. Thorne continued, flipping a page. A child's drawing, found in the McAllister home in Briar Hollow. Dated December 11, 1959, the day before the disappearance. The file contained a faded photograph of the drawing. Stick figures, crudely drawn, were tumbling into a swirling hole, above which floated the 3 interlocking circles. The caption, in a child's uneven scrawl, read, Mommy says we're going on a trip tomorrow night. A cold dread washed over Whitaker. Mommy says we're going on a trip. He thought of the half-eaten breakfasts, the toys left mid-play. They knew? Some of them knew. There's more, Thorne said, his voice grim. Peachy conducted discrete radiation scans in the Briar Hollow church pews, years after the event. He reported finding trace amounts of Einstein-Rosen particles. Einstein-Rosen particles? Whitaker frowned. Theoretical residue of wormholes. Exactly, Thorne confirmed. Interdimensional doorways. The Bureau dismissed his findings as pseudoscience. Fired him 3 weeks after he submitted his final report. Labeled him a crank, a reputation risk. So they just ignored it? Whitaker was aghast. If he was right, Thorne's face was granite. He was found dead in his university lab in 1994, Whitaker, 2 years after he was fired. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Official cause of death, suicide. Asphyxiation. He slid another photograph across the desk. It was a crime scene photo, stark and brutal. Dr. Lorne Peachy, slumped in a chair, and around his wrists, binding them tightly, was a length of rope. Whitaker stared at the rope, his blood turning to ice. It was red, a child sled rope, identical to the one they'd seen on Miller's Hill in Briar Hollow, still tied in its perfect and used bow. No, Whitaker whispered, pushing the photo away, his stomach churning. That's not possible. It's a coincidence. It has to be. Coincidence, Whitaker? Thorne's voice was dangerously low. A Princeton physicist investigates Briar Hollow, comes up with a theory about interdimensional doorways, gets fired by the Bureau, and then turns up dead, bound with a sled rope that looks like it came straight out of the vanished village? How many coincidences are you willing to swallow before you admit we're swimming in waters so deep we can't even see the bottom? The conflict between them, usually a simmering undercurrent of Thorne's relentless drive versus Whitaker's cautious apprehension, flared into open tension. So what are you saying, Marcus? Whitaker challenged, his voice rising. That the Bureau killed him to cover it up? That we're part of some grand conspiracy to hide the fact that monsters are real and they're snatching towns off the map? I'm saying, Thorne bit out, his eyes blazing, that someone, or something, didn't want Peachy talking. And they left a goddamned calling card from Briar Hollow to make sure the message was clear. Stay away. The air crackled with unspoken accusations and a shared, terrifying understanding. The note, "They are where you will be soon," felt less like a prophecy and more like a direct, personal threat. The Peachy file, with its horrifying postscript, drove them to dig deeper into the local history of Briar Hollow, into the folklore of the region. If this was something ancient, as the symbols seemed to suggest, perhaps the answers lay not in physics, but in forgotten stories. They found it in the dusty archives of the West Virginia State University, in the unpublished ethnographic notes of a long-dead anthropologist named Dr. Eleanor Vance. She had spent years in the 1920s documenting the oral traditions of the vestigial Cherokee communities in the Appalachian Hills. "Listen to this, Carl," Thorne said, his voice hushed with a strange reverence as he read from Vance's spidery handwriting. "The local Cherokee tribes, the ones who lived in the valley before the settlers came, they had a name for the area where Briar Hollow was eventually built. They called it Nunhai." "Nunhai," Whitaker repeated. "What does it mean?" "It translates roughly to Land of the Immortals, or, more chillingly, Land of the Moon-Eyed People," Thorne read. Vance writes about their legends. They believe the Nunhai were a race of spirit people who lived underground, or in another dimension, and only emerged at night. They were said to be protective of certain sacred sites. Protective how? Whitaker felt a familiar prickle of unease. Thorne continued reading from Vance's notes. The elders passed down a warning, specifically recorded by Vance in 1792, given to the first white settlers who tried to encroach on the valley. It said, "Do not build where the three circles meet. For the keepers of Nunhai are jealous of their places, and they take whole towns to punish greed and sacrilege." Whitaker stared at Thorne, his mouth dry. Where the three circles meet. The symbol. They knew about the symbol in 1792. "It gets worse," Thorne said, his voice barely a whisper. Vance describes a cave system, about 50 miles west of Briar Hollow's eventual location. In 2014, long after Vance was dead, a group of anthropologists, following her notes, rediscovered one of these caves. Inside, they found a painting. He slid a photograph across the table, a reproduction of a faint ochre and charcoal drawing on a cave wall. It depicted crude, elongated figures, their eyes like large, pale moons, seemingly vanishing into a swirling spiral. And at the center of that spiral, unmistakable, were the three interlocking circles. Carbon dated to approximately 1200 AD, Thorne stated, his voice flat. And beneath it, Vance's notes mentioned something the 2014 team also found, a series of tally marks. 11 of them. Like a countdown. A countdown. Whitaker's mind raced. Greed and sacrilege. What did the mayor of Briar Hollow do? the one before the vanishing. Thorn's eyes were like chips of ice. The week before December 12, 1959, Mayor Alastair Thompson, against considerable local opposition from older families who knew the legends, signed the final approval for a coal mining company to begin exploratory drilling on Blackwood Ridge, land the Cherokee had always considered sacred, land that overlooked the valley of Nunhai. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening resonance. The Soviet incident, Peachy's interdimensional coordinates, the ancient Cherokee warnings, the symbols, the mayor's fateful decision. It wasn't just one theory. It was a terrifying tapestry woven from threads of science, folklore, and a cosmic horror that defied all human understanding. The keepers, Whitaker breathed, the name sending a shiver down his spine. They took the town as punishment. Or as a warning. Thorn corrected, his gaze distant and troubled. A warning that has been repeated. A warning that might come again. He looked at the evidence board, at the note from the vault. They are not lost. They are where you will be soon. The conflict was no longer just between them or with their superiors. It was a conflict with the very fabric of reality, with forces ancient and unknowable. The stakes were not just their careers or their sanity, but potentially their lives and the lives of anyone who stumbled too close to the truth of Briar Hollow. The thriller had deepened, the mystery coiling around them like a primordial serpent, its fangs dripping with a venom distilled from the terror of centuries. And Act 2 had just set the stage for an even more terrifying revelation. The intervening years had been unkind to Carl Whitaker. The Briar Hollow case, officially relegated to the Bureau's coldest, dustiest archives, had never truly left him. It had burrowed deep, a parasitic dread that gnawed at his peace, fueled by the memory of Marcus Thorne's relentless, ultimately fruitless, pursuit of an enemy that defied definition. Thorne was gone now, claimed by a heart attack 5 years prior, his obsession with the vanished village a cautionary tale whispered among younger agents. Whitaker had retired, seeking solace in the quiet anonymity of a small lakeside cabin, trying to outrun the ghosts of interlocking circles and the chilling promise of a shared, terrible destiny. But Briar Hollow, it seemed, was not done with him. October 2017. The call came on a crisp autumn morning, shattering the illusion of his tranquil retirement. Special Agent Lena Hansen, young, sharp, and heading the FBI's newly formed Anomalous Historical Cases Unit, a fancy name for the department that inherited all the Bureau's weirdest, most intractable skeletons, was on the line. Mr. Whitaker? Agent Hansen, we need you to come in. It's about Briar Hollow. Whitaker's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard that name spoken with official urgency in over 2 decades. Briar Hollow, he repeated, his voice raspy and used to such jolts. What about it? That case is a fossil. A fossil that just showed signs of life, sir, Hansen replied, her voice professionally calm, but underscored with a tension Whitaker recognized all too well. Some urban explorers, spelunkers, whatever you call them. They stumbled into an uncharted cave system about 30 miles west of the old quarantine zone. They found something. Something significant. Significant how? Whitaker pressed, a familiar knot tightening in his chest. He already knew, with a sickening certainty, that this would not be simple. Shoes, Mr. Whitaker, Hansen said, her voice dropping slightly. Hundreds of pairs of them, arranged in circles. Whitaker closed his eyes, the image of the 3 interlocking circles, the Cherokee warning, Peachy's coordinates, all flooding back. Do not build where the 3 circles meet, a cave. Of course, a cave. He was on a Bureau jet within hours, the quiet life he'd tried to build crumbling around him. The cave entrance, when they reached it via a rugged, muddy track, was cordoned off, a temporary FBI command post already established. Hansen, a woman whose composed demeanor couldn't entirely hide the flicker of unease in her eyes, met him. The Yuxers who found it are being debriefed, she said, leading him towards the cave mouth, where halogen lamps cast an eerie, sterile glow. 2 of them, a young couple. They're pretty shaken up. Said the place felt wrong. Like a church, but a bad one. What did they see exactly? Whitaker asked, his gaze fixed on the dark maw of the cave. He could almost smell it again, that faint, sharp tang of ozone and burnt copper. Or was it just memory playing tricks? 327 pairs of shoes, Mr. Whitaker, Hansen said, her voice low. We've counted. men's, women's, children's, all neatly arranged in concentric circles in a large central chamber, as if the owners just stepped out of them. Whitaker felt a tremor pass through him. 327. The exact number of people who had vanished from Briar Hollow in 1959. The descent into the cave was suffocating. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the scent of ancient stone and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sweetness, like decaying fabric. Their flashlights cut nervous beams through the oppressive darkness, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the crunch of their boots on the uneven floor. They reached the main chamber. It was vast, cathedral-like, and there they were. Shoes. Everywhere. Arranged with an almost ritualistic precision in perfect, concentric circles, spiraling out from the center of the cavern. Wingtips beside worn work boots, elegant ladies' pumps next to scuffed loafers, tiny Mary Janes and sturdy boys' Oxfords. A silent, orderly congregation of the departed. Whitaker walked among them, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He felt like an intruder in a sacred, terrible place. The emotional impact was overwhelming, a tidal wave of grief and unresolved horror. He could almost see the ghostly figures of the villagers, standing there for a moment before being taken. Forensics are still processing, but the initial findings are perplexing, Hansen said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. She gestured to a tech carefully bagging a man's leather brogue. The leather on most of these, the general style, consistent with 1950s manufacturing, what you'd expect from Briar Hollow. But, Whitaker prompted, sensing the inevitable but that always accompanied this cursed case. Hansen took a deep breath. But the soles on a significant number of them, including that one, are made from a synthetic rubber compound that wasn't patented until 1983. The stitching patterns on others? They match a specific type of automated textile machine that only came into use in 2009. Whitaker stared at her, the implications crashing down on him. Temporal anomalies, again. Just like Peachy theorized. He felt a surge of anger, bitter and old, at the Bureau for dismissing the physicist, for letting Thorne chase his tail for years. It gets stranger, sir, Hansen continued, her voice tight. She led him to a smaller, carefully preserved child's saddle shoe, isolated in an evidence container. It was tiny, heartbreakingly so. Attached to its lace was a small, laminated tag. Whitaker leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. The tag was printed with neat, official-looking text, property of Briar Hollow Reclamation Project, EST 2026. 2026? Whitaker whispered, his mind reeling. Reclamation Project? What in God's name does that mean? He looked at Hansen, a wild, desperate hope warring with an even greater fear. Are they planning to come back? Is this some kind of preparation? Hansen shook her head, her expression bleak. We don't know, Mr. Whitaker. But the lab results on the shoes themselves, they're the most chilling part. She held up a preliminary report. We've managed to extract DNA from skin cells found inside several dozen pairs. The DNA is a match to the missing villagers of Briar Hollow. We cross-referenced with old medical records, descendants we could trace. So, they were their shoes, Whitaker said, a strange sense of validation mixing with the horror. Yes, Hansen affirmed. But there are no wear patterns, sir. None. The leather is creased where feet would have been, the insoles are molded. But the outer soles? They're pristine. These shoes, Mr. Whitaker, according to our forensic anthropologists, they've never been walked in. Never been walked in. Whitaker felt the cave walls closing in, the air growing thin. 327 pairs of shoes, imbued with the DNA of their owners, yet untouched by the earth. Shoes from the past, the present, and the future, all gathered here in this silent, subterranean tomb. It's a message, Whitaker said, his voice hoarse. Like the note in the vault. Like Peachy's death. They're showing us they can move through time as easily as we walk across a room. He thought of the Soviet report, the village materializing for 317 seconds. They're not just in another place, Hansen. They're unstuck. Unstuck in time. What are we dealing with, Mr. Whitaker? Hansen asked, her professional composure finally cracking, revealing the raw fear beneath. Who are they? Whitaker looked at the circles of shoes, at the child's saddle shoe with its impossible future date. He thought of the Cherokee legends of the Nun High, the Keepers. He thought of Jedediah's door. "I don't know who they are," he admitted, the weight of decades of unanswered questions pressing down on him. "But I think they're still counting." He remembered the 11 tally marks in the ancient cave painting. And that tag, Est 2026. That's not a promise of return, Agent Hansen. His voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with a chilling certainty. That's an appointment. The silence in the cave was broken only by the frantic beating of their own hearts. The mystery of Briar Hollow had just deepened, its tendrils reaching out from the past, through the present, and into a future that suddenly felt terrifyingly close. The shoes were not just echoes of the lost, they were harbingers. And the countdown, it seemed, was far from over. The chill of the cave, with its silent congregation of shoes and the impossible pronouncement of the child's saddle shoe tag, property of Briar Hollow Reclamation Project, AST 2026, clung to Carl Whitaker like a shroud long after he'd left West Virginia. The year 2017 was drawing to a close, but the date seared into his mind was 9 years hence. An appointment. Agent Lena Hansen, to her credit, hadn't dismissed his fears. The evidence was too bizarre, too tangibly impossible, to ignore. The Bureau, however, moved with the ponderous caution of a slumbering giant. The cave findings were classified at the highest level. The shoes, the tag, the temporal anomalies, all buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape and hushed, fearful whispers. But there was one more piece of evidence from that subterranean tomb, one final, chilling artifact that Hansen had secured before the site was hermetically sealed. A small, unassuming reel-to-reel audio tape, found nestled amongst the children's shoes in the innermost circle. It was labeled simply, Briar Hollow Chamber Recording. Months bled into a new year, 2018. Whitaker, now an unwilling consultant, found himself in a sterile, soundproofed listening room deep within the bowels of the Hoover building. Opposite him sat Agent Hansen, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, a shared dread hanging heavy between them. The tape deck, a vintage machine meticulously restored by Bureau technicians, was ready. "The lab boy said the tape itself is anomalous," Hansen said, her voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the oppressive silence. "Polyester base, but with trace elements they can't identify. They estimate it could be decades old, or it could have been manufactured yesterday. Or, like the shoes, both." Whitaker nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the slowly turning reels. "What are we expecting to hear, Lena?" The urban explorers who found the cave didn't mention any sounds, apart from dripping water, Hansen replied. But the tech who cataloged the tape said he thought he heard something. Faint. He didn't play at all. Said it made him uneasy. "Uneasy is this case's middle name," Whitaker muttered. He gestured to the machine. "Let's get this over with." Hansen pressed the play button. For a long moment, there was only the soft hiss of blank tape. Then, a sound emerged, faint at first, then growing in volume. A low, guttural moan, a sound of profound, collective anguish. It was followed by another, and another, until the room was filled with a chorus of raw, human suffering. Screaming. Not the sharp, sudden shrieks of immediate terror, but the prolonged, hopeless wails of souls trapped in an unending torment. Men, women, children, their voices were distinguishable, a cacophony of despair that clawed at Whitaker's sanity. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Hansen had her eyes closed, her face a mask of controlled horror. "How long?" Whitaker managed to choke out. "The screaming, it continues for 5 minutes and 17 seconds, Hansen said, her voice strained. 317 seconds. Whitaker's blood ran cold. 317 seconds. The exact duration the Soviet Project Moros team had reported Briar Hollow materializing in the Siberian snow. The exact duration of the figures pounding on invisible barriers, their mouths stretched in silent screams. Now here were those screams, captured, terrifyingly real. Then, as abruptly as it began, the screaming stopped. It was replaced by a sound that made Whitaker's heart clench with a fresh wave of grief and recognition. Hymns. Faint, ethereal, sung by a multitude of voices, the melody achingly familiar. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yeah, we wept. Frank Henderson, Whitaker breathed. The milkman. He heard them singing this. The morning he found the village empty. It's identical to the psalm he reported, Hansen confirmed, her eyes now open, wide with a mixture of awe and terror. The intonation, the slight quaver in some of the voices, it's as if we're listening to the villagers themselves, in that church, in those final moments. The hymns continued for several minutes, a sorrowful, spectral chorus that seemed to echo from another dimension, another time. Then, they too faded, replaced by a silence that was somehow more menacing than the sounds that had preceded it. Is that it? Whitaker asked, a sliver of hope in his voice. Hansen shook her head slowly, her gaze fixed on the turning reels. There's something else. The text couldn't identify it. They just called it vocalizations. A new sound began to emerge from the speakers. It was low at first, a guttural rumbling, like stones grinding together in the belly of the earth. Then it rose in pitch, morphing into a series of clicks, whistles, and deep, resonant growls. There was an intelligence to it, a horrifying, alien cadence that was unmistakably linguistic, yet utterly incomprehensible. And then, Whitaker realized with a jolt of pure, ice-cold dread what was so profoundly disturbing about it. It's backwards, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Play that last part again. Reverse it. Hansen's fingers fumbled with the controls. The strange, growling vocalizations played again, then stopped. She manipulated the playback. The sound that emerged was no less alien, but now, terrifyingly, it almost sounded like words. Distorted, guttural, but with a horrifying semblance of speech, spoken in a voice that was neither human nor animal, a voice that seemed to emanate from the darkest corners of a nightmare. So new while, be, where we are. Whitaker recoiled as if struck. The words, though reversed and warped, were chillingly clear. A distorted echo of the note from the vault. They are not lost. They are where you will be soon. Hansen slammed the stop button, her face ashen. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing. This tape, this is their voice, Whitaker said, the realization dawning with crushing weight. The keepers, the Nunhai, whatever they are, this is them. The Bureau has scheduled this tape for declassification and public release in 2027, Hansen said, her voice barely a whisper. Under the Historical Anomalies Transparency Act, they think it's just unexplained sounds. Whitaker stared at her, a cold, terrible certainty crystallizing in his mind. He thought of the child's saddle shoe tag, EST 2026. He thought of the ancient cave painting with its 11 tally marks, the Cherokee warnings, the cyclical nature hinted at by the Soviet incident 27 years after Briar Hollow. And now, another cycle. They don't understand, Whitaker said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The release date is irrelevant. It's a distraction. He looked at Hansen, his eyes hollow. Did your team find anything else in that cave? Anything that looked like a calendar? A marker? Hansen frowned. Then her eyes widened in sudden recollection. Yes, one of the techs cataloged it as unidentified debris. A flat piece of shale, found near the center of the shoe circles. It had markings on it. We assumed they were natural striations, but... Get it, Whitaker commanded, a new, desperate urgency in his voice. Minutes later, the piece of shale lay on the table between them. It was unremarkable, except for the series of 12 crudely scratched lines on its surface. 11 were grouped together. The 12th, set slightly apart, was deeply scored, almost gouged into the stone. And beside that 12th mark, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right, was another symbol. 3 interlocking circles, and beneath them, a date, painstakingly etched. December 12th, 2026. The 67-year pattern. 1959, 2026. The next cycle, Whitaker breathed, the last vestiges of hope dying within him. The shoes in the cave, they weren't just a memorial. They were a staging ground. A promise. The reclamation project, it's not about bringing the old villagers back. It's about a new collection. December 12th, 2026, Hansen whispered, her gaze fixed on the etched date. That's less than 9 years from now. The current date was May 14th, 2025. No, Carl. It's next year. 18 months. Whitaker felt the room spin. He'd lost track, the years blurring in his semi-retirement. 18 months. The countdown was already almost over. We have to warn someone, Hansen said, her voice rising with a desperate edge. The director, the president, Someone has to know. Whitaker looked at her, a profound weariness settling over him. He thought of Thorne, of Peachy, of the decades of denial and obfuscation. Warn them of what, Lena? That the boogeyman is real? That a date scratched on a rock by an ancient entity is a death sentence for who? Another town? Us. He gestured to the tape recorder, to the piece of shale. They've seen the evidence. They've rationalized it, classified it, scheduled it for a convenient, distant release. They won't listen. Not until it's too late. The conflict was no longer about finding answers. The answers were here, stark and terrifying. The conflict was with time itself, with an inevitable, cyclical horror that had been set in motion centuries, perhaps millennia, ago. The stakes were no longer just their sanity, but the horrifying certainty of an impending, unpreventable event. Then what do we do? Hanson asked, her voice small, lost. Whitaker picked up the piece of shale, the etched date cold against his palm. He thought of the final, chilling words from the vault, now given a voice, a grotesque, reversed promise from the tape. They are not lost. They are where you will be soon. We wait, Whitaker said, his voice a hollow echo of the despair that filled him. We watch the calendar. And we pray that this time the keepers are taking volunteers. The silence of the listening room was absolute, a prelude to a much larger, more terrifying silence that was poised to descend, not just on one small village, but on anyone who had dared to listen too closely to the whispers from the void. The countdown had begun, and the final act was already written in stone. So what really happened in Briar Hollow? The answer might be on that tape, and thanks to a source who'll remain anonymous, we've secured a copy. But here's the problem. YouTube's already flagged this video just for mentioning it. If you want to hear what's on that recording, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. Because when we drop the tape next week, well, let's just say you'll want to watch it before the authorities take it down.